Hello, everybody, and welcome to Rule of Saints, Episode 4. This is Patrick Cassidy. Today, we're going to talk about the errors of the ex cathedra minimalists and the Latin Mass. I do plan on creating a King Arthur and St. Columcille video, but I got in an argument with several people online about ex cathedra statements and what qualifies as an ex cathedra statement. So I felt like this is a very urgent video that needed to be made. So that's the reason I'm going to put my King Arthur video on hold, but I will work on that in the next week or two. So to get started, let me explain what an ex cathedra minimalist is. Uh, this video I have at the bottom, I want you guys to go visit this video and watch it after my video is over. He speaks much more eloquently than I do, and he gives examples of ex cathedra minimalist errors. The video is called 5 Ex Cathedra Statements, and the video is by Catechesis Vids. Very good video, also a very good channel if you guys haven't seen it before. He's very well spoken and actually documents all of his citations. So Vatican I exact qualifications for ex cathedra is what most people use when they talk about what qualifies as ex cathedra, or at least most modern theologians. When the Roman pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith and morals to be held by the whole church. He possesses that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his church to enjoy. So to break this down, number one, the first qualification, speaker must be Roman pontiff. Number two, he must speak as universal pastor and teacher. Number three, he must exercise his supreme apostolic authority. Number four, he must define a doctrine concerning faith and morals. This one's very important when we're discussing what the minimalists believe. And number five, he must intend the doctrine to be held by the whole church. So, ex cathedra minimalists are on a spectrum. It's not just you are a minimalist or you're not a minimalist. On the far end of the spectrum, you have what's called strict minimalism. And on maybe the more moderate or middle end of the spectrum, you have moderate ex cathedra minimalism. The most extreme strict minimalists are those who claim that there are only 2 ex cathedra statements ever made in history. They view the Immaculate Conception, which Pope Pius IX. I am going to use I am going to read the Roman numerals because I'm going to be talking about a lot of different popes in this video, and I am terrible at misreading Roman numerals. So just for the fact that I don't want to make any mistakes, forgive me for just reading the Roman numerals rather than saying the numbers. But Pope Pius IX, the Immaculate Conception, is one of the ex cathedra statements that they recognize. And number two is Mary's bodily assumption, Pope Pius XII. The moderates don't ignore the history of infallibility the way that the strict minimalists do, but they tend to frequently claim that ex cathedra statements are juridical only, and usually don't have a unanimous agreement on what they believe to be ex cathedra, because none of them can agree on what has been defined and what hasn't been defined. So basically, those qualifications that I just showed you, the moderate minimalists, what they'll do is they'll claim, well, even though you've got 6 or even though you've got 4 of these qualifications, it still doesn't qualify. Or even though you have 3 of these qualifications, it still doesn't qualify. Or they might try to interpret a sentence that's slightly different, that doesn't explicitly say that the doctrine is held by all the church. Even before I became Catholic, I remember reading some Sedevacantists blogs, and there was lots of ex cathedra debates by Sedevacantists versus what would be considered heretical modernist within the Catholic Church. And that's actually the first time, even prior to me becoming Catholic, that I actually did hear some people say, oh, I only believe in 2 ex cathedra statements. I actually think there was and I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe that there were several cardinals and possibly even a statement by a pope where he basically said like, oh, under these qualifications of Vatican I, there's very few ex cathedra statements. So the ex cathedra minimalists are not just a small group of people outside of the church or a small group of theologians. There's actually quite a few priests and bishops and cardinals who do hold to ex cathedra minimalist beliefs. But this is not the teaching of Vatican I. This, and I will get to evidence of that here in a second. This video that I have presented on this slide also shows you, for example, you can see right on the title of the video, there's 5 different ex cathedra statements which are qualified. Their argument is these two statements, or for the strict minimalists, their argument is these two statements are not only statements where the formulas used contain every element of Vatican I Pastor Eternus. Their claim Canon 749.3 as a basis which says, or they claim Canon 749.3 as a basis which says, no doctrine is understood as defined infallibly unless this is manifestly evident. So if they don't have one or two of the qualifications, they basically say this is manifestly not evident. And one of the biggest ways that they claim, they basically reject entire papal decrees. So you'll have papal decrees that meet 4 out of the 5 qualifications, and just because they say, well, I don't think that the whole church believes this, or just because a pope doesn't say, oh, I don't think the entire church believes this, even if a historian comes along and says, no, this is a widespread practice, everybody believed this, the pope didn't need to make a statement that everybody believed it because everybody knew that everybody believed it. The ex cathedra minimalists will still reject that teaching. And it gets even more sinister because they don't just reject the fact that it's ex cathedra. Oftentimes they commit heresy and they will just straight up reject the authority of the church or reject the authority of that particular pope. That's the reason why the more and more you delve into the heresy of modernism, the more and more ex cathedra strict minimalists that you'll find, because they basically want to reject the entire, as much of the old church as possible is what they're attempting to do. So in order for them to reject that, they're misinterpreting Vatican I. And I will show evidence that their teachings are inconsistent or even contradictory to Vatican I throughout this slideshow. So, example of common minimalist theological arguments online. If you guys watch any of my previous videos, I talked about how my personal experience in the church is that Catholics that I met within the Novus Ordo were far less kind. They were far meaner in terms of how much they hated the Latin Mass, how much they hate people, other fellow Catholics who go to the Latin Mass. I've heard other people with the opposite experience as me. I've heard other people who said, no, people who go to Latin Mass are judgmental. And, don't get me wrong, I've gotten in fights with SSPXers online, so I know that there's a lot of judgmental, zealot, uh, traditional Catholics out there. I know that these types of people exist, but from my personal experience, everybody within the Latin Mass is very welcoming, but for some reason, like multiple Novus or Ordo churches that I go to, like you run into just really mean people that hate the Latin Mass. Like they really hate traditional Catholics. So these individuals that I got in an argument with online, which you're seeing on the screen right now, this is visual evidence of what I've experienced through my Catholic conversion. So YouTube influencer TJ Haynes from the YouTube channel Catholic Firebrand was praising YouTuber T.D. Barrett for taking an axe rather than a scalpel to the preconciliar Latin Mass. This was after T.D. Barrett claimed the preconciliar Latin Mass was deficient and inferior to the Novus Ordo. I requested citations and it became a big debate, and you can see where I requested citations from both of them below. Neither of these individuals appear to have enough education to know whether they are strict minimalists or moderate minimalist, but they're likely moderate minimalists based upon their comments. So I don't know whether or not these people are strict minimalists or moderate minimalists, but the majority of minimalists are moderate minimalist. They might actually be strict minimalists. We didn't get into that deep of a conversation. But what I do know is that they reject the ex cathedra statements of the Council of Trent, which I will cover in this video. T.D. Barrett was unable to provide citations. Rather, he claimed he was paraphrasing Vatican II's Sacrosanctum Concilium. Long story short, he was misinterpreting which elements of Sacrosanctum Concilium were reforms and which were restorations. And he didn't realize that Sacrosanctum Concilium relies upon ex cathedra and dogmatic statements of the Council of Trent. T.D. Barrett essentially was falsely interpreting every element of Sacrosanctum Concilium text to be a reference to the liturgy of the Latin Mass. Because of their minimalist views and hatred of the Latin Mass, they completely ignored all the references to Latin being preserved within the Latin Rite mentioned explicitly within Sacrosanctum Concilium. Because Sacrosanctum Concilium doesn't cite all of its sources it used from the Council of Trent, although it does have many footnotes on the Council of Trent, and it actually does cite the Council of Trent dogma once within the text. Neither one of these Catholic influencers realized they were contradicting the Council of Trent in their arguments and making statements that the Council of Trent anathematized. So now I will present the evidence that the claim the Mass is required to be celebrated only in the vernacular, or the claim any Mass not in the vernacular is deficient, have been anathematized as a sign of judgment de fide, and it can never become Catholic truth because the anathema coheres with dogma. I know you guys just saw a bunch of Latin theological terms on there, but I'm about to show you the sources of where those terms came from. Before I jump to the next slide, though, I do want to read T.D. Barrett and T.J. Haynes' comments real quick. So T.D. Barrett says, "The Church has explicitly said as loudly and as magisterially as it can that the version of the Mass which existed prior to the Council was deficient, in need of reform and improvement, and has in fact been reformed and improved with a superior version, more fit to serve its integral purpose in the Novus Ordo. Any notion of equality between the two liturgies, unless it is about equality in validity, is a rejection of this completely obvious and indisputable message from the magisterium." And the term that he uses, superior, is important because we do have documents that talk about improved upon, but superior is obviously something of pride. This is like, you are deficient, I am superior to you. This is not what improved upon means, obviously. But let's jump on to TJ. TJ says, "The claims here are a little more like an axe than a scalpel, but they are essentially true. Good job going bold on this one. Let's be friends." So this is where I jumped in and I said, "Can either one of you cite your sources? I have attempted to find the word deficient, but have been unable to do so. What Latin word are you translating from which magisterial text?" So he didn't say that he was talking about Sacrosanctum Concilium when he first made this comment. I later figured out that that's what he was talking about, or that's what he was referring to. But basically, his comment that he just made right here is condemned by Canon 9 of the Council of Trent, mainly on the basis that he's attempting to claim that the vernacular portion of the Mass is superior, or somehow the portion that was improved upon. Now, I'm actually going to go into what the restoration means. So the term restoration and reform, from his interpretation of Sacrosanctum Concilium, that's not what that means. It was not restoring a deficient mass or a mass that was in error. I mean, the arrogance that a person has to have to believe that their mass is superior to the saints. I mean, think of all the saints and all the church fathers that came before in the church, and this dude thinks he's somehow onto some superior faith than them. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But not surprising given how much heresy is circulating around in the church right now. I mean, I've seen worse. I'll be honest, the antinomian heretics that you see amongst like the left-wing communists and feminists, they're definitely worse than the ex cathedra minimalist, but nevertheless they're kind of similar because this guy thinks that he's better than the saints that came before him in all the church. Let me jump to the next slide though. So Canon 9, Session 22 of the Council of Trent. If anyone says that the rite of the Roman Church, according to which a part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low voice, it is to be condemned, or that the Mass ought, or I'm sorry, let me reread that. If anyone says that the rite of the Roman Church, according to which a part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low voice, is to be condemned, or that the Mass ought to be celebrated only in the vernacular language, or that the water ought not to be mixed with the wine offered in the chalice, because this is contrary to Christ's institution, let him be anathema. And the portion of this paragraph that we're going to focus mostly on is, or that the Mass ought to be celebrated only in the vernacular language. This is what those who believe the vernacular language being superior to the Latin believe. So what does this mean? Number one, claims that the Mass ought to only be in the vernacular are anathematized. Number two, there is a direct dogmatic judgment that the Church is not doctrinally bound to celebrate Mass only in the vernacular, and I will prove that dogma here in a second. A non-vernacular Mass is lawful. Number three, a positive judgment is entailed which says the Church may lawfully retain and improve non-vernacular sacred liturgical language, and such worship is not intrinsically impious, illegitimate, or contrary to Christ. Number four, this is immutable and cannot reverse. Vernacular only celebration cannot become a universal doctrinal necessity, nor may non-vernacular worship be condemned as such. And once again, I will explain the dogma of Canon 9 here later. And let's go ahead and cite some sources on the next slide. So Pope Pius IV and Pope Pius VI, ex cathedra citations. Pope Pius IV is in 1564. So this is actually closer to the time of the Council of Trent. Pope Pius IV says, "We, yielding to the petition made to us by the aforesaid legates in the name of the Ecumenical Council of Trent regarding the confirmation thereof, with apostolic authority and with the advice and assent of our venerable brethren, the cardinals, having previously had mature deliberation with them, confirm each and all of the things which we have been decreed and defined." Notice it says "and defined," that's very important. "In said council under our predecessors, Paul III and Julius III, of happy memory, as well as during the time of our pontificate, we command that they be received and inviolately observed by all the faithful of Christ, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," or the Holy Ghost. So this is a ex cathedra statement that contains all of the elements that I showed you previously. Number one, apostolic authority. Number two, confirm each and all. Number three, decreed and defined. Number four, by all the faithful of Christ. Number five, inviolately observed. Number six, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. This was all stated again in Pope Pius IV's formal Bull Benedictus Deus as well. So Pope Pius VI, and part of the reason I'm saying the Roman numerals is because I'm already sure I would make a mistake with these being so similar. But Pope Pius VI is in 1791, so a couple hundred years later. Quod aliquantum, and I'm sure I might be mispronouncing that Latin as well, but quod aliquantum, he says, "But in order that our same adversaries might preserve the decrees of this assembly, they say that they pertain to discipline, which, since it had been changed often on account of the vicissitudes of the times, now in the same way could be changed. But among the decrees themselves, not only the disciplinary ones, but also several others combine to overthrow pure and unchangeable dogma, as we have heretofore shown. However, if we are to address discipline, who among Catholics ever affirmed that ecclesiastical discipline can be changed by laymen? Furthermore, it is altogether certain that discipline cannot change at random or arbitrarily. But before we touch upon these articles, we consider it worthwhile to say first how often discipline coheres with dogma and conduces to the preservation of its purity, not to mention how little benefit the variations permitted by the Roman pontiffs, however rarely, have brought, and how briefly they have lasted. Assuredly, the sacred councils in most cases have separated by anathema the violators of discipline from the communion of the church. So the important phrases, which I put in black here, I put in bold here on the screen. We have coheres with dogma, and then we're also going to have connected with dogma, connected to dogma. I believed connected with dogma is a better translation of that. But what he's saying is that this is an ex cathedra statement, and that it is cohering with dogma. So the argument, the conversation I was having with these two people online, this is what we were talking about. They eventually just resorted to like trying to cast me as a devil or trying to cast me as evil. So basically anybody who tries to tell them, hey, you're in error, you're making a mistake. If you try to argue with the ex cathedra minimalist, and then even if you're able to qualify every single qualification of what is ex cathedra, like they'll still try to not admit their error. But let's go on to the next slide. Pope Pius VI, remember this is 200 years after Pope Pius IV. It's a little bit confusing. But Pope Pius VI, in his Ex Cathedra Canon 9, continued, indeed, at the council in Trullo, the penalty of excommunication was inflicted on those who consumed the blood of strangled animals. Then if anyone shall undertake in whatever way to eat the blood of animals, if he is a cleric, let him be deposed, but if he is a layman, let him be excluded. In many places the Council of Trent subjects to anathema the assailants of ecclesiastical discipline. For Canon 9 of Session 13, De Eucharistia, inflicts the penalty of anathema on him who shall deny that each and every one of the faithful of either sex, when he shall have reached the age of discretion, is bound every year, particularly in Eastertide, to receive the communion according to the precept of the Holy Mother Church. In Canon 7 of Session 22, De Sacrificio Missae, he is placed under the anathema who says that the ceremonies, vestments, and external signs that the Catholic Church uses in celebration of Mass are incitements to impiety rather than services of piety. And this is the one that's most important, but notice he's saying that all of these anathemas are dogmatic and 100% have to be followed by all the faithful. But in Canon 9 of the same session, he likewise is subject to the anathema who asserts that the rite of the Roman Church, in which part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low voice, should be condemned, or the Mass should be celebrated in the vulgar tongue only. So Pius VI's concluding judgment: from the declaration of anathema against the opponents of many headings of the discipline, we clearly, notice he says, clearly understand that it was always considered by the church to be connected to dogma, and that it should not be changed simply at any time or by anyone, but by the ecclesiastical power alone, when it is manifest that what was preserved until now had been done wrongly, or when the necessity of acquiring a greater good urges it. So when he says what has been done wrongly or the necessity of requiring a greater good urges it, he's not referring to the accidental restorations of the Mass. He's referring to like if a priest performs something incorrectly, basically. Let's go on to the next slide. So I put this little chart together when I was in arguments with the two YouTubers online. Pope Pius VI on Trent's Canon 9. I'm not going to read all of this because I already just read some of it, but the important parts of it are all in this chart that I'm showing you. How often discipline coheres with dogma and conduces to the preservation of its purity. In Canon 9 of the same session, he likewise is subject to the anathema who asserts that the rite of the Roman Church, in which part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low voice, should be condemned, or that the Mass should be celebrated in the vulgar tongue only. From the declaration of anathema against the opponents of many headings of discipline, we clearly understand that it was always considered by the Church to be connected to dogma, or connected with dogma. We have the Latin terms up here, so if you want to actually see what the Latin words are, we have coheres with dogma or connected with dogma. I am going to explain what dogma he's talking about, because a lot of people, the first time you hear this, the first thing you should think is, wait a second, are you saying that claiming that the Mass can only be spoken in the vernacular is dogma? No, he's talking about a different dogma. He's talking about the dogma behind the reason why you cannot claim that the Mass can only be spoken in the vernacular. The dogma behind this is that the Mass at the time is being spoken in Latin. So these are people from the these are people who wanted to practice the Mass in the vernacular, who were basically claiming that the Mass in the vernacular was a restoration that was superior to the Latin, even though the Church was speaking Latin at the time. Um, and and this is from the Synod of Pistoia, which I'll talk about again here in a second. So what specifically can never change? The immutable judgment. The Mass is not divinely or doctrinally bound to vernacular-only celebration. Pius VI cites Canon 9 amongst the disciplinary anathemas and then concludes that such discipline has been regarded by the Church as connected with dogma. Therefore, a Church-approved non-vernacular liturgical language is and remains doctrinally legitimate. This is the precise judgment of Canon 9's vernacular clause. The retained language discipline coheres with the Church's authority over worship, the legitimacy of approved rites, and the sacrificial, not merely didactic nature of the Mass. So step 1, the text anathematized, or the Mass ought to be celebrated only in vernacular, is declared anathema. Step 2, direct dogmatic judgment. The Church is not doctrinally bound to celebrate Mass only in the vernacular. A non-vernacular Mass is lawful. Step 3, positive judgment entailed. The Church may lawfully retain and approve a non-vernacular sacred liturgical language. Such worship is not intrinsically impious, illegitimate, or contrary to Christ. And step 4, it's immutable. This cannot reverse. Vernacular-only celebration cannot become a universal doctrinal necessity, nor may non-vernacular worship be condemned as such. Another notable mention, Melchior Cano, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but in 1560, when I said a sign of judgment de fide in one of my earlier slides, this actually comes from Cano. So he has different types of signs as to whether or not a judgment is de fide, which later became part of the qualifications for Vatican I. So that's very important in terms of like what is a qualification of an ex cathedra statement. Melchior Cano is one of the very first or earliest church scholars to discuss this issue. So he says the first and indeed an evident sign is of those asserting the contrary are judged to be heretics. So if a pope says, you're a heretic, this is a negative judgment possibly pertaining to dogma. If somebody makes a heretical statement against a dogma, and if a church says you're a heretic, this is ex cathedra. A second sign is when a synod formulates its decree in this manner. If anyone holds this or that, let him be anathema. So this second sign is what the Council of Trent uses. So the Council of Trent uses this specific formula, which Melchior Cano qualifies for ex cathedra statements. I'm going to go back to a couple other statements. You guys don't have to read these full things. You can always come back and pause it if you want to. But basically, TJ and TD Barrett, they both started claiming that they're being attacked by the devil because they got a lot of criticism. Once TJ said he wanted to take an axe to the Latin Mass, and then he praised TD Barrett for claiming that those going to Novus Ordo are superior, and that their mass is superior to the mass of all the saints. Obviously they got a lot of backlash for this, so now they're claiming, oh, it's the devil. Anybody who criticizes us, it must be the devil. This is the devil in the church. But on this third picture here with T.D. Barrett, he says Ratzinger on all of the problems in the old Latin Mass that needed to be fixed and purged. So notice these words he keeps on using, like superior, purge, deficient. None of these words actually exist in any of the magisterial teachings. So TJ is a liar because he's actually giving credit to T.D. Barrett for inventing terms that don't exist in the magisterial teachings. So he's saying, oh, you're the devil, and you're teaching something that's against the magisterial teachings, and we need to stick to the magisterial teachings. But the problem is these words, purged of the mass that all the saints used to go to. I haven't read this magisterial teaching. Can you show me where this magisterial teaching is? So with all due respect, I think he just needs to admit that he's wrong. Like he tried to make a somewhat insulting comment to me, but he tried to say, with all due respect, I don't think you should be making YouTube videos. Now, I actually have more of an education than him, so I'm actually more qualified to be making these videos than him. But, first he tried to go after qualifications. Then he tries to just say, you're the devil. Like, if you criticize my ex cathedra minimalist views, some of which are heretical and blasphemous, then you must be the devil. But we can let people judge for themselves. The devil is the father of lies. So the question is, does the mass that all the saints need to go to need to be purged? Does the magisterium teach this? Does the magisterium teach that there needs to be a purging? I've never read any of these documents. It sounds like a lie to me. So the key point, though, with all these different heresies that they're teaching, Ratzinger certainly believed that the historical accretions could and should be reformed, but as Benedict XVI, he rejected the idea that the traditional Roman Mass was something intrinsically defective or harmful that needed to be purged. Instead, he taught reform in continuity, preservation of the Church's riches, and honor for the venerable liturgical tradition handed down to us. So let's go straight to Pope Benedict. One other comment I want to make on this is that another thing that's important about his the book. Let me go back to that previous slide. Actually, I guess it won't let me. But the book that he was quoting from Pope Benedict, that actually was written in the 1960s, and Pope Benedict's position actually changed over time. So that's another important element of where he's. There's nothing wrong with Pope Benedict's book that he wrote in the 1960s, which I'll mention here in a second. But nevertheless, like, Pope Benedict's position did change over time prior to him becoming Pope. So Benedict XVI in 2007 1962 missal as an expression of the Church's Lex Orandi wrote, "The Roman Missal promulgated by St. Pius V and revised by Blessed John XXIII is nonetheless to be considered an extraordinary expression of the same Lex Orandi of the Church, and duly honored for its venerable and ancient usage. These two expressions of the Church's Lex Orandi will in no way lead to a division in the Church's Lex Credendi." So also in 2007, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the church's faith and prayer and to give them their proper place. In the history of the liturgy, there is growth and progress, but no rupture. So obviously, these teachings are completely contradictory to what these two YouTubers are attempting to claim. That they think Benedict wanted to purge the Mass of the Saints. That's pretty crazy. Sacrosanctum Concilium and Dogma in the Council of Trent. So, Sacrosanctum Concilium 55, the dogmatic principles which were laid down by the Council of Trent remaining intact, communion under both kinds may be granted when the bishops think fit. So there actually were several footnotes in which the Council of Trent was mentioned within Sacrosanctum Concilium, but this particular line within Sacrosanctum Concilium very explicitly says the dogmatic principles which were laid down by the Council of Trent remaining intact. So I don't know when I told both of them that this was dogma and this was ex cathedra, and they basically denied it. I mean, but it's right there in the text. So I actually asked them. I was like, "Did you even read the text? Like, I don't see how anybody can read this and say, otherwise, unless they just have reading comprehension skills." Sacrosanctum Concilium 36. The use of the Latin language, particular law remaining in force, is to be preserved in the Latin rites. So the reason why the Latin needs to be preserved is because of Canon 9 of the Council of Trent. Because the dogmatic principles which were laid down in the Council of Trent are remaining intact, that's the reason why the use of the Latin language, particular law remaining in force, is to be preserved within the Latin rites. Sacrosanctum Concilium 54 says steps should be taken so that the faithful may also be able to say or sing together in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them. Pope Pius IV infallibly confirmed the Council of Trent in its entirety, including Canon 9, which condemns the proposition that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vernacular tongue only. Sacrosanctum Concilium does not overturn Trent. It works within that doctrinal framework. It restores ancient elements and allows wider vernacular use and preserves Latin. Ex Cathedra Minimalists falsely perceived the restoration or reform to mean that the preconciliar Mass was deficient. This meaning of restoration for them is that the Latin Mass must be purged of its errors and deficiencies. This is a false teaching as shown above. The actual meaning of restoration is that over time certain portions of the Mass were forgotten by accident. And the restoration is just a preference of incorporating those forgotten elements back into the Novus Ordo Mass in an experiment to increase participation. And the verdict is still out. So when I say that it's an experiment, whenever these heretics claim that their Mass is superior to the Mass of the Saints, Vatican II didn't actually know that. So when Vatican II allowed for the expansion of vernacular, they didn't know what the result was going to be. There was no sign from the Holy Spirit which told them this is 100% going to increase participation in the Mass. Now they did have a lot of scholars. The Holy Spirit was present at the council, but there was no definitive knowledge. And if you actually read the writings, they make it very clear that they don't have definitive knowledge of what the results of the council is going to be. So in order for something to be superior, even if you want to take that arrogant approach in calling it superior, you have to actually prove that it's superior. But they didn't have that knowledge. They didn't have that foreknowledge, or that evidence hasn't been presented. The question then becomes, now that we're many years after Vatican II, there have been some people, and I've actually seen contradictory reports. I've seen some people say the Latin Mass is growing faster. I've seen other people say no, the church was shrinking and it would have shrunk more. But it's kind of like you're looking through a crystal ball at that point in time, and you don't really know. Like, there's no way of knowing what would have been or what could have been. So that's what I mean by experiment, is that, they didn't really know. They wanted to expand the participation, but they don't know what the results are going to be. And people are still studying it to this day. I'm going to list all of the restorations to the Novus Ordo on this next slide as well, too. So the forgotten elements restored to the Novus Ordo Mass. So this is what the restoration within Sacrosanctum Concilium actually means. It's not the false interpretation of the ex cathedra minimalist. Their false interpretation is that the restoration is that you have a deficient mass in the past, and this new restoration is superior, and we're restoring it to a better, superior form. Well, this is what it actually means. The forgotten elements that were restored are the prayer to the faithful, Sacrosanctum Concilium 53. Especially on Sundays and feasts of obligation, there is to be restored, after the gospel and the homily, the common prayer or the prayer to the faithful. Concelebration in Sacrosanctum Concilium 57-58. Concelebration had remained in use in the church both in the east and the west. The council therefore decided to extend permission for concelebration. So these are two priests or multiple priests serving together. Restoration of the catechumenate for adult, Sacrosanctum Concilium 64. The catechumenate for adults, comprising several distinct steps, is to be restored. Restoration of lost elements of the rites, Sacrosanctum Concilium 50. Other parts which suffered loss, and notice I put this in bold, through accidents of history, are now to be restored to the vigor which they had in the days of the Holy Fathers, as may seem useful or necessary. So notice the phrase, through accidents of history. Ex cathedra minimalists want to ignore the actual meaning of restoration, and instead they want to use Pope Benedict's problem of divine worship to claim that restorations were restoring deficient or flawed elements of the Mass. As I've shown previously, this position is heretical and anathema under the Council of Trent. Other times, if they are antinomian heretics who reject the moral teachings of the Church, they will claim to be the spirit of Vatican II, and they will try to claim that the Mass is evolving from a previously flawed version of the Mass. This is also heretical and anathema. The term improved upon is not the same as superior. Superior is filled with pride and insinuates deficiency, which is a heresy. The term improved upon is also not definitive, because we don't actually know what the results of the social experiment are going to be. Vatican II never claimed to definitively know whether using the vernacular will improve participation, and this is still being debated. Some evidence has actually been shown to the contrary. This is just the 7 qualifications again. I'm not going to go over all these because we already talked about them in a previous slide. But this chart that I put in front of you has the 7 qualifications for what is ex cathedra. And it has a little bit more detail than what I covered previously. So I wanted to throw this in here. So we know that the Council of Trent is ex cathedra. And that's the one thing you need to take away from this slide, is that this is a definitive fact. Everything has been defined. There is no debating that this is ex cathedra. Harmony and continuity. Pius IV infallibly confirmed the Council of Trent in its entirety, including Canon 9, which condemns the proposition that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vernacular tongue only. Sacrosanctum Concilium does not overturn Trent. It works within that doctrinal framework. It restores ancient elements, allows wider vernacular use, and preserves Latin. So what specific dogma was Pius VI speaking of in Canon 9? Remember, Pius VI is a couple hundred years after IV, so it's not different pope, couple hundred years later. Canon 9 of the Council of Trent anathematizes the belief that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vernacular tongue only. The specific dogma being addressed is the dogmatic doctrine of the sacrifice of the Mass and the Church's authority over its liturgical celebration. Since the Mass was being celebrated in the non-vernacular Latin tongue, it is anathema to claim that it must be vernacular or that that vernacular is superior, not the same as improved upon, or that non-vernacular Latin was at any time deficient. So these are all anathema. And the reason why they're all anathema is because when Pope Pius VI claimed that this is coherent with dogma, he wasn't saying that the Latin language was dogma. Obviously, the early church was in Aramaic. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that the Mass itself is infallibly the sacrifice of the Mass. So the sacrifice of the Mass, you can't claim that it's an error. That is a dogma, and you are a heretic for claiming that it is deficient. Sometimes, like in one of the comments I showed previously, he said he put a qualifying comment in there where he's like, I'm not saying that the sacraments. He's like, oh, I'm not saying it's the sacramental portion of the Mass. It's like, no, what Canon 9 is saying is that the Latin portion of the Mass, you can't claim that that's deficient because it is a recognized portion of the Mass. Any other portion of the Mass that previously existed, you can't claim that they are deficient. Now, you can claim that I want to improve upon it. So it's kind of like you have a good car, but you want a better car, or you have an awesome car, but you want an even more awesome car, right? That's what improved upon is. But you can't say this previous car was a piece of shit, and now I've got a superior car. That's what they're claiming, and that's why that's heretical. That's kind of the difference. So that's the dogma that we're talking about behind Canon 9. So this does not mean that the Mass cannot be said in the vernacular, or that the Pope doesn't have the authority to change the Latin Rite into the vernacular for purposes benefiting the faithful. It's anathema to claim anything is in error within the use of the Latin language and the Latin Rite, though. This also does not mean that the priest can't say the Mass wrong, or a holy church can't make mistakes in liturgy, but the Mass, which was approved by ex cathedra authority, is dogmatically approved as the holy sacrifice of the Mass. You cannot claim that it is in error. There's nothing wrong with Pope Benedict questioning the way people receive the Holy Mass and his problem of divine worship. Notice how I said the way that people receive. So I question the way that I myself receive the Novus Ordo all the time. But it's heretical for me to say that Novus Ordo is deficient or in error, unless the priest is actually making an error in the way that he performs the Mass. So what Pope Benedict was doing in his book is he's basically questioning the way that people receive the Mass. The question is, if we give the Mass in the vernacular, will it be received better by the faithful? He's not saying the reason why the faithful are not receiving the Mass is because the Latin is in error, or the Latin is deficient, or this was a mistake. The entire Mass was that all the saints had been going to for thousands of years. This whole thing was a mistake. That's not what he's claiming. Pope Pius VI was specifically addressing the Synod of Pistoia when he was referencing Canon 9 of the Council of Trent, cohering with dogma and connected with dogma. They wanted to simplify the Catholic liturgical rites by introducing greater use of the vernacular language and pronouncing the liturgical prayers aloud and increasing the people's active participation. This was a larger movement of what they viewed as liturgical restoration. Pius VI in his Auctorem Fidei 33 addresses them directly. Pius VI censors this proposition as rash, offensive to pious ears, insulting to the church. In Auctorem Fidei 66, he says, false, rash, disturbing to the order prescribed for the celebration of the mysteries, easily productive of many evils. So as you can see here, he doesn't have very much nice things to say about the Synod of Pistoia attempting to use vernacular language and claim that the Latin Mass was inferior to what Mass they wanted to perform. during the Synod of Pistoia. Oxford historian Sean Blanchard describes Pistoia as a radical forerunner of Vatican II. This doesn't mean that Vatican II adopted propositions condemned by Pius VI, though. What it does mean is that the reason Sacrosanctum Concilium decreed the preservation of Latin is because the Council of Trent's anathemas are infallible. The restoration of forgotten elements portion of Sacrosanctum Concilium is mostly about attempting to increase participation of lay people without knowing what the actual outcome of the changes are going to be. It has nothing to do with restoring anything that was broken, and as was claimed by the Synod of Pistoia, and is also being claimed by the Ex Cathedra Minimalist. So how does this impact Traditionis Custodes? Traditionis Custodes does not say that the 1962 Missal is erroneous. Article 1 says the liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II in conformity with the decrees of Vatican II are the unique expression of the lex orandi of the Roman Rite. Article 2 then gives the diocesan bishop authority to authorize use of the 1962 Missal, subject to the Holy See's rules. Pius VI creates serious theological problems for anyone calling an approved liturgy intrinsically erroneous. Pope Francis never did this in Traditionis Custodes, though. It's the Ex Cathedra Minimalists and the antinomian heretics who are falsely claiming that Pope Francis did this. Pope Francis allowed for the continuation of the Latin Mass. He never called for any purge, as the heretics claim. So what did Pope Francis allow bishops to why did Pope Francis allow bishops to restrict the Mass then? This was never a broad call to restrict the Mass. Rather, it was a reaction to a survey of bishops performed by CDF in which Pope Francis said he saw a situation which preoccupies and saddens me. Now, he said concessions had sometimes been exploited to widen gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the Church. He wanted it resolved on a case-by-case basis rather than broad. Excuse me. So basically, Pope Francis saw a study that concerned him and saddened him. You probably had some schismatic Latin Mass people, and you probably also had some radical liberal priests and bishops who just lied in the survey. Made Pope Francis concerned. So what he did is he basically said, I want to give you guys more authority to handle the situations locally. So Pope Francis didn't make any broad decisions on the Latin Mass. He just wanted things to be more local, so he tried to decentralize the decisions. Pope Francis said the Roman Rite had been adapted many times over the course of the centuries to be both preserved and renewed in faithful observance of tradition. Notice he never says his restrictions were a restoration of something that was broken or deficient. Pope Francis never claimed that Pope Benedict's expansion of the Latin Mass was in error, and Pope Francis never claimed that the Latin Mass was deficient to the Novus Ordo. He could never say that because that would be anathema. All that Pope Francis did was give bishops more authority due to concerns he saw in a CDF survey. So it is of my personal opinion that Pope Francis's approach caused much harm by emboldening Ex Cathedra Minimalist and antinomian heretics in their attacks on the Latin Mass. There hasn't been much transparency on the CDF survey, so there's no way for me to give it much critique in terms of Pope Francis's decision. Pope Francis's entire papacy was filled with a lot of confusion and continues in the current synod and synodality. The future of the Latin Mass and Ex Cathedra Minimalist. So this is my final slide, and then I'll let you guys go watch that video at the beginning on the first slide. My prediction is that Ex Cathedra Minimalists will eventually be declared as formal heretics, specifically for contradicting Vatican I. This probably won't happen right away because there are many priests and bishops who hold either the strict minimalist or moderate minimalist views, and the church has been hesitant to interfere in historical debates. So as of right now, you're allowed to believe that there's only two ex cathedra uh, declarations throughout history, but the problem is Vatican I, that would contradict Vatican I. If that's your position, eventually the conversation is going to be had, but it just hasn't been had yet. If you want examples, watch the video I posted on the first slide of this slideshow. Specifically, ecumenists trying to unite with Lutherans were advocating for a narrow, there have only been two ex cathedra declarations approach, because in their crazy minds, they thought this would allow them to more easily unite with the Lutherans. Uh, Evidence of this is in the video I posted on the first slide that you can watch after this slide. The moderate ex cathedra minimalists are mostly uneducated, and they just claim every previous statement by a pope or church council is juridical without actually studying to see if it's been qualified as an ex cathedra statement. The two individuals I debated on X probably fall into this category. I'm not really sure if they're a strict minimalist or a moderate minimalist, uh, because when I showed them the canons of the Council of Trent were declared as binding ex cathedra, they denied it and downplayed the canons as being only juridical, not ex cathedra. They don't want to admit the Sacrosanctum Concilium preserves the Latin Mass and specifically names the Council of Trent as a dogmatic binding force on the document. The good news for us faithful Catholics who love the preconciliar Holy Latin Mass is that I believe that Canon 9 of the Council of Trent is going to protect us from the attacks by ex cathedra minimalists and antinomian heretics. The entire premise of their arguments are heretical. Even in some hypothetical scenario where an anti-pope attempts to close down every Latin Mass except for one single church, simply so he can claim that he isn't violating the anathema of Canon 9, the majority of bishops and cardinals would eventually see that this would be a violation of Canon 9 of the Council of Trent, and that popes would be that pope would be exposed as an anti-pope. I don't think this scenario is going to happen. There's no reason for us to be afraid of Satan, or it's actually heretical if you think Satan is going to conquer the church. Our faith requires us to know that the church is going to succeed. Vatican I Pastor Eternus is very clear that ex cathedra declarations are part of church history and not confined to only several papal declarations. So we have nothing to worry about. The priests and bishops whose teachings are in contradiction with Vatican I, they're the ones who should be worried. I want to thank everybody for watching the slideshow. This is the last slide, and make sure you go back and watch that other video. I'm a little bit more of a technical speaker, but the other YouTuber is a lot more eloquent than me, so I'm sure you'll have a lot easier time listening to him. But hit the like button, subscribe, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I look forward to talking about King Arthur next time.